You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Well, welcome back to the 95 Podcast. As always, my name's Austin Savage. I'm here with my good friend, Dale Sellers. And Dale, I have a different question to start off today's episode for you.
Ooh,
I know, exciting. Yeah, it's the first one. I'm not going to ask you how you're doing because you know what, Dale? I don't care how you're doing today. No, I'm just kidding. Today, I am curious, what has been like the most consistent way you have been encouraging pastors this week? I know you've been on calls like crazy. So what has been the most consistent thing you are saying?
Step back from the edge of the cliff. Quit standing out on the interstate in front of the tractor trailers. Come on back home, boys. Get on back. Yeah, we were just talking off mic here or off recording. I don't know who said this, but someone recently said 80% of pastors are considering quitting right now. Now, I don't know if that's true and how you would know if that's true, but I will tell you this. I mean, the tension and the pressure that these folks are under right now is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And I have done more ministry talking with pastors in the last 3 weeks. Here's how I can describe this year. I feel like it's July.
Yeah. Why do you feel like they're at that place like so early into this year? I mean, like, or just because like, I mean, the pressure has been going on for a year now. Like, why do you feel like it's kind of culminating now?
Because we're American pastors and we're used to getting what we want when we want it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we talked about this when the pandemic hit. Everybody looked forward to Easter, and it was a distraction. After Easter was over, for about 2 weeks after Easter, everybody went into the tank depression because it's like, this is not over. We want it to be over. And listen, these poor pastors have been just beat up. I mean, if you're in a church, if you say we need to wear masks, people get offended. If you say we don't need to wear masks, people get offended. If you say that we want to honor our government guidelines, well, you're compromising. If you don't honor the government guidelines, you don't care about people. I mean, I have never seen a time that has been so stressful. But here's what I know to be true. COVID-19 will not close one church. COVID-19 was not a problem creator. It was a problem accelerator.
Yeah.
So if you were already missing it on doing online, that got accelerated. If you were already behind with your in-person experience being what it needs to be, that got accelerated. Mm-hmm. If you were not leading through a team concept and a biblical concept, that got accelerated. And so what's happened is now the new year, and I knew it would happen, it's kind of like, okay, when we get to 2021, it's just all going to get better. And I can tell you right now, 2021 has been harder for our family at this point than 2020 was. And so, people don't know where to turn. And here's what I'm excited about. They're going to turn to Jesus eventually.
Yeah.
It took me about 40 years of ministry to finally figure that out. But, at some point, if you just turn to Jesus and let him work through you and quit trying to do ministry for him and let him do ministry or do ministry from him, then you'll start experiencing the joy that I believe God has for us. So,
man, that's what it's all about.
That was a long answer to a simple question, but it's kind of where it's at.
Yeah. Dale, it was a good answer. And I'm excited for our guest today on the podcast. We are talking to Marianne Sibley, and I wanted to read you this, just a little section of her website. It says, "You could call me a consultant, but I'd much rather you call me a cheerleader, a guide, or maybe even a ninja. I'm what you may call a get-it-done kind of gal." So, Dale, tell us about our guest today.
Well, she's the most ninja person I know. Honestly,
an introduction.
I met Marianne through before the pandemic hit. I was serving 2 weeks a month in our toddler class at our church. And we had a lady named Michelle who she drove that. I mean, she the first time that I served in the ministry, they have a rule at our church that you have to have you can have only 3 kids per adult.
Yeah.
And then they have to cut it off. Well, my very first day of ever serving in the toddlers class, and this is just the 1 to 2 year olds. somehow there was a communication breakdown.
Oh no.
And Michelle and I were in, there were 16 kids, just the two of us.
Woo.
I never met Michelle before, but we became lifelong friends at that moment. And we have a rule at our church that, the guys can't change diapers. And so she was just, the whole time it seemed like she was just changing diapers and I'm just holding and crying babies. So we became friends. And through that conversation one day, she found out what I did with 95 Network. And she said, well, you need to meet my friend Marianne. And so she said she does something that would be helpful to what you guys do. And I did meet Marianne, and we had a chance to get to know each other. And I absolutely love what she does. I wish we could just take and make 1 million of her and put her in every church, because they need what she does. And so I'm very excited about what she's going to bring to the table today. Marianne, how are you doing?
Well, this ninja is doing just great, Dale. Thank you.
What does that mean? Why do you call yourself a ninja on your
She
site?
called herself that. I didn't.
Oh, well, other people called me that. When I used to be on church staff, the church was growing like crazy. And I was doing the thing I tell people not to do now. I was the one running around trying to do everything. Yeah. And no one could ever find me. And so they would say, she was standing right here. And then they'd say, I just saw you at the other campus. And then you appeared on the shuttle. And I'm like, well, I'm like a ninja. Like, I'm not really here. You don't know where I'm going to be.
That's awesome.
So that's where that came from. And I'm half Japanese. So that's to boot. That just seemed natural.
It just goes together.
Yeah.
So that is awesome. Yeah. Marianne, tell us a little bit of your story and kind of what got you into ministry. And then we have so many questions for you.
Yes, we do.
So many questions. Well, yeah, my story is just, I'm going to try to really condense it for you because I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up Buddhist, actually.
Wow.
And my very first time being invited to church wasn't until I was 40.
Really?
40. And so 40, yeah, it was like 2 years ago.
I was going to say,
I know.
That was last week, wasn't it?
I see you calculating, Dale. Stop it.
It was last week.
But I think what God has done when he did everything he did to connect me with the people that loved me where I was, accepted me where I was, and I had all the barriers. I was a hotshot vice president in commercial lending millions of dollars. I was traveling, doing all that. Then I was divorced, single mom, and church was the last thing on my list. In fact, it was the no thing on my list. And so for God to do what only he could do, introduce me to a group of people that loved me into the church. And the experience of me first attending church, even though I was so called, I was very confident and I looked the part from the outside. Boy, did I need Jesus. And so, of course, God and those people that love Jesus knew that. And it is fresh in my mind today of what that must feel like, regardless of what size. And y'all have to remember, when I attended this church for the first time, talk about the heart of this ministry, 95 Network. We maybe had 200 people total, including all the children and everybody.
Yeah.
And that's where I met Jesus. Right.
Wow.
And then God did what he could do. And I eventually was asked to come on staff and a lot of things changed. And then because we were growing, the church said, hey, someone needs to oversee all these volunteers. We're growing like crazy. And that was my new job. No experience. All I had was corporate America work. And I'm like, gee, are you allowed to say and do these things in church? So I made a lot of mistakes. So part of what I try to help churches do is say, don't do that.
Yeah.
And what it feels like to be a solo person in a ministry that's really not supposed to be about any one person other than Jesus anyways. And so I did that for 12, 13, 14 years. And then it was time to step off staff. So at that point, just in guest services ministry, we had over 1,000 volunteers in that ministry and about 200 leaders leading. So I always love to say that it really was building a team of leaders, leading a team of leaders. Like it's just that layering thing. And it became a really beautiful, rich season.
Wow.
And so now I am the cheerleader for other folks that are in that same spot, that when they tell me their story, I go down memory lane. I'm like, yep.
That's really
that
good.
was that. Yeah. But I tell you, the quick thing when Dale, when y'all invited me to be on it, I remember I sat on that email for a little while. And I thought, no, I can't be on this. Very generous, Marianne, we love what you do, but I'm like, no. So I finally, the best answer is always honesty.
Yeah.
So I replied, I said, gosh, guys, thanks a lot. I don't know why you're asking me. I haven't done anything in the past year. COVID shut everything down.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have anything to offer, but if you still want me, I'll be here. If not, I totally understand.
Yeah.
Which with that answer was great, because that's why I want you here.
Yeah.
because things have been shut down, and the thing that we've been focusing on, and I want you to talk a little bit about your ministry. It Matters Spark. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Ignite What Matters.
And so explain that a little bit about what you do. And then I'm going to explain why I wanted you here, even though you haven't done anything in a year. It plays into where I want to go.
Yeah. The heart of the ministry of Matter Spark is really igniting that thing that's already inside church leaders, church volunteers, church people. Like we forget it's in there because we get complacent, we get tired, we get distracted, we just get into a rut. And so what I love to do when I come along church leaders is nothing new is under the sun, right?
Yeah.
But I get to use my story and the experiences in building a volunteer ministry and ignite that thing that says, remember who's really in charge. Remember that you're not supposed to be alone. Mm-hmm. And this is what it could look like. So when I get to tell stories of what God did through the ministry, when I was at a church in Raleigh, they a lot of times look at me like that's not possible.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's all I knew. Again, remember, I did not grow up in church.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm thinking, isn't every church like this? Doesn't every ministry go like this? Doesn't everyone learn and then do and all this? And my husband, who did grow up in church, looks at me all the time and go, no, Marianne, you have no idea. No. And it's interesting now that I'm on the other side, especially since we moved, we had to find another church. I'm visiting churches and going, who are these people in their cliques and not thinking about the people walking through the door and just being, just into the rut. I said, I don't understand how they don't understand. I am looking to get connected and they don't seem to care.
Wow.
And so when people would tell me stories, when they used to serve with me and they would move away, they would write me emails and say, you have no idea. It's not the same like this everywhere. So my heart is that, why isn't it? Every place at the end of the day, the church needs to be the place where we all find refuge and hope, because that's where I found it. Right. Because part of my story was, even though it looked good on the outside, I had battled depression a little bit, but in this season as a divorced single mom for 4 or 5 years, it hit big time. There was actually one attempt where I tried to take my own life and God interceded, and I didn't even know him. So you talk about a generous God.
Yeah.
And so I would look to Sunday to be that place where someone other than my kids would be talking to me.
Wow.
That really cared about me. And I live for Sundays. And so that's the refuge place that we should be for the world. And why aren't we? I think we just forget, right? And so I love to come in there and remind people the beautiful call that we are called to do in people's lives. And when we can boil it down to that and get away from all the other superfluous things and allow others to come alongside us, the load is lighter and we can accomplish those things.
Yeah. Can I ask that question to you? Like, why aren't we? Why is that not a consistent thing in churches?
Well, a couple of things that I, just from my experience and talking to some leaders, some of it is language. So we are so used to saying certain language, and I think we're not talking the same language. So when I say, hey, what you're doing, like guest services is not a throwaway ministry. It's a ministry within a ministry. And they all nod and go, yeah, we're doing ministry and smile. And I'm like, no. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about discipleship. We're talking about not wasting an opportunity.
Yeah.
So there's a language barrier. The other thing, I think there's a numbers barrier. I think even more recently, because churches have decreased in number of not only attendance, but volunteers.
Yeah.
And so when I say, wow, this is a great time to reset, their brain is still in, well, I must have the same exact number of people and the same people. And I'm like, well, maybe not, maybe, but let's start with what you have. And they go, well, there's only like 3 of us. I'm like, where 2 or more are gathered. I think that's somewhere in scripture. So let's just start there. And they look at me like I have 3 heads. So I think there's a numbers bear. We can only make it work if we have this number.
Wow.
Right. Or if we had these people, or my language and your language are not aligning. And I think you're saying it and we're good enough. And then I think what you were saying earlier, Dale, people are tired. Church work is hard.
Yep.
I did it for a very long time and also suffered the burnout, and I get it. And so that's the other passion, is we need to bring the hers and the Aarons and the people around us to help hold our hands up, because we just can't do it by ourselves. We're not supposed to.
Yeah. Isn't that good? That's good stuff.
It's good.
So I'm going to use that as a springboard into why I wanted you here, and the fact that you haven't quote unquote done anything in the last year and a half or last year because of COVID, because things are slowly beginning to shift toward opening up for some places that are listening right now. It's opened up a lot. Some places hadn't opened up at all. And I heard this description, and it's just been so true, that once the backside of the pandemic gets here, it's going to be more like a sunrise than flipping a switch. And that's been the case. So one of the things that God put in my heart to really focus on last fall, that we have really focused on, is introducing this idea or this concept of hybrid church, specifically to our small and mid-sized churches. And a lot of our emphasis has been on trying to get them to update their online format and understand that we're not talking about just live streaming your service. That can be part of it, but we want you to create digital content. And we've connected with a company called Alter Live, and they're helping churches create community online. Today's in the opposite direction. Today, I want you to help us understand, okay, as people do come back, we've got to do a better job of what I call the in-person experience. And this all comes out of these arguments that took place once the pandemic hit and churches were forced to go online, especially those who did the Facebook Live thing. Everybody was like, hey, our church of 60, man, we've got 500 people coming now. Yeah. And it was just like, it's like everybody's like, all right, we're going to stay online forever because we have all these people coming. And then all of a sudden people start saying, yeah, but they're just looking and they're going. And so this argument breaks out about the importance of engagement. And when the pandemic began, I think the average engagement in America was around 20 minutes, and then it wasn't long, but then it dropped down to about 10 minutes, and now it's about 3 minutes. And so the point is, you've got to really connect with people very quickly when it's online if they're going to stay engaged. Well, if I'm watching your service and I don't like it online, I just push a button and leave.
Right.
But what I believe is there's been lots of people sitting in our buildings for years that if they could push a button and leave, they would.
Yeah.
Because it's not engaging with them. It's not connecting with them. And so that has to do somewhat with the service itself. But what I want to help our churches to understand is you've got about a minute of first impressions to connect with people. And if even if they stay for the service, if you didn't connect with them, they don't come back. Right. So I thought, my friend Mary Ann, this is her focus on hospitality and guest services and things like that. So I want you to kind of help us today understand how, as people begin to come back, how can we connect with them? And again, it's not about them coming and enjoying the service. There's so much more to church than that.
Yeah.
So that was a big setup. I teed you up. Knock it out of the park.
Well, my very first time going back to coming to church, and again, it was a teeny tiny church at the time, and the parking lot was could fit 20 cars. And I'm driving into church, and for the very first time, and I literally thought I was going to throw up.
Wow.
Has anyone ever said that word on your podcast?
I'm sure there's been worse.
There's people who thought it, but nobody said it.
Okay. Because there's no other way to say it. Because that's how I felt. Like my thought process was I was not going to like them.
Yeah.
And they were not going to like me.
Yeah.
They were going to judge me as a single mom, and I knew they were going to be judgmental and boring. And you
knew that by driving up?
That's what's my impression of church for 40 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
40 years of hearing and seeing and people in the neighborhood and how they could have had an opportunity to reach out and care for me, but didn't. Right. And what you see on TV, all of that.
Yeah.
So now I get to go experience the real life thing. So many people are like, when I think about coming to church and they're going to experience a real life thing in person, whether you were like me, wanting to get sick because it was the very first time, or you've been coming to church for a long time and you're just tired, or you've just gotten a bad diagnosis, or you've lost your job and you can't feed your kids. Like, for me, when I talk about first impressions, it's not just for the first time visitor. It's for anybody. It's the whosoevers. Because I used to have folks come and they'd say, okay, Marianne, your church is growing like crazy. We're having 1,000. It's like over 14,000 people now, like all these campuses. It's getting crazy. And they're like, what's the magic formula? Right?
That's the question we always get.
We always get that.
Right. What's the formula? And I remember thinking, oh man, I have no clue.
Yeah.
Like there's like, so what do you do? And yes, I'm not to say throw that out the window of having some thought and strategies and all.
Sure.
We all can do that. But for us, it was, okay, taking the verse, as far as for me and my household, we will honor the Lord. And I'm like, okay, as far as for me and this ministry that God has put me in stewardship, this is how we will honor the Lord. We want to create a culture and an environment that the whosoevers, it'll just get permeated. Like, I'm not going to ignore someone who's hurting and been here for 5 years just to get that first person. Like, we want to all be on our game for one another's all the time. Wow. And so to create that and get our focus, it's like the both and for the first time. When I pulled into that parking lot of like 20 cars, my thought was, gee, I surely won't find a place to park, so I get to leave. And I had 2 middle school kids and boys in my back seat, my boys, and they were like, let's go to church, because some youth people, those crazy people, were pouring into them. And for 2 years, I said no. I said no for 2 years. So I'm pulling in, and there was a guy standing in this tiny parking lot smiling, waved me to him, walked me with my car to a parking spot. Amazing. And in my mind, it's like God was like, let's just get her parked. Oh my gosh. Like, if we can just get her parked, then she has to get out. And it's step by step. So creating the ministry that just removes the barriers and the fears and anything that we want to put as an excuse of why I shouldn't have come to church today. Because, man, we can bring out excuses left and right. Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's like casting the vision to the people, like, why do we need people in the parking lot? I hear churches say, well, Marian, it's not that hard to park. Our parking, we're huge. I'm like, it's not about parking cars. It really isn't about parking cars. It's about someone drove in and you're going to smile and wave at them, and you're going to reinforce that they made the best decision of the day to come to church because they had other options. And so we want, the moment we have an opportunity to see and connect with them eyeball to eyeball, we have to affirm that they made the best decision today, because they're thinking of other things already. Yeah. Like, I just can't wait for this to get over. Right. So we just created this warm handoff, as we called it, that starts in the parking lot and carries them all through, and then reverse it back out at the end.
Yeah.
At the end. And so we had a campus, multi-site campus, and I went to go visit, and I could tell things were kind of getting loose, is a nice way to put it. And so I'm standing there, and the last service is finished, and I see our guys and gals that served in the parking lot. We call them roadies. They pick their own name because they serve in the road.
Yeah.
And they wore t-shirts with tire tracks down the back of them. Like, just let your people have fun. Let them create their space. And they were all going home or going to get their kids. And so I got the leader and I said, hey, what's going on? Where's everybody? He goes, oh, we're leaving. I said, no, I see that, but how come no one's in the parking lot? He goes, oh, we've done our job. They're here. Like, they know how to leave. I'm like, that's not why you're here.
Yeah.
You're here to put the book in. Doesn't even God say beginning and end? He didn't say beginning and you'll figure your way out. He doesn't do that. So I said, here's the vision. We want the first thing and the last thing. Like, they've heard a crazy, awesome, dangerous message about who Jesus is. Now they're going to be driving out because their kids were crying or something happened. And you're going to be the last person they see to affirm, let God do. And he's like, okay, I remember. Thanks, Marianne. Well,
That's so good.
About a month goes by. I go back out to the campus. This young man, he's probably in his early 40s. He comes running up to me. I love when they run up to me like they're 5 years old. And he's like, you're not going to believe it. I said, try me. He said, so I went out to the parking lot because I heard you. And at this point, we were meeting in a school. Mm-hmm. This was a setup teardown thing, right?
Yeah.
Small. And there was a huge tennis court between the road and the school. So when you drove by, you really couldn't see the school or that we had church. So he's like, I'm standing out there and I'm just waving goodbye to people. Yeah. And there's a guy hitting tennis balls by himself against the wall. And wow. I looked at him, and nodded like, hey, how's it going? He's like, hey.
What up?
What up? I know. I do it all the time. That's how the men usually. What's up, Marianne?
We do that. I don't know why, but we always do it.
But he said, I did the what's up to him. And then he walked over and said, hey, what's going on in the school? Is it a festival? I mean, it's Sunday. What is all this? And he looks at me and he goes, oh my goodness, Marianne, I have never invited anyone to church in my life. And I had an opportunity to say, well, this is church. You should come sometime. And then he said, he came today.
Wow.
And he said, you will never not find me in that parking lot. I'm like, you just never know. It's not about directing and parking. This is about being available for wherever God wants to make a connection. He's going to use his people. He does it. He's done through the beginning of time. Yeah. He uses his people to connect with other people in the most remote, beautiful places. And so we want to make sure that our folks are in the places available, because not only was this an amazing opportunity for the tennis player, like God did the work in the volunteer.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the ministry within the ministry, for us to then celebrate it and talk about it and tell that story and say, God can actually use you in a parking lot. Like who thought?
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that answers the question. I can tell stories all day. But.
So what you're saying is basically church is more than just coming here, the preacher preach.
Sort of.
Sort of.
But
First impressions, last impressions, middle
here's the
impressions.
Thing. Yes. I remember one time it was, oh my goodness, at one of our campus, it was crazy. And so I'm like, oh, I want to jump, put on a vest that went down to my knees because I'm really short. And I would love to be where when someone flashes their lights, they will point to a volunteer and say, see that one waving at you? Go to her. And so I was that person one morning.
Yeah.
And so we don't send them to a spot or point. We point them to people, like the warm handoff. So they came to me and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. They roll their windows down. I said, I've got the best parking spot for you. And we took them and blah, blah, blah. Then after church, I'm in the exact same spot saying goodbye, right? We're going to make that connection. And this car rolls by and I'm like, oh, that's them. And I'm waving, they roll their window down. I'm like, how was it? Tell me the truth. You can hate it. Like, give permission to say, it's not my thing. That's okay. There are great churches, other churches in the area. And they were just like, wow, you people act like you're happy to be at church.
Never seen it before. Yeah.
I mean, that was the context. You act like everyone seems like they're glad they're here.
Yeah.
What is that? Why would you be glad to be at church? So it is beginning and end. But the other very important thing is I would always say to my pastors, and if someone was preaching, they would get to the point where they'd come to me and they say, hey, Marianne, I'm going to be doing a thing. Could you get your volunteers to wear purple this weekend? Or somehow we would weave it in, because I said, we are here as a ministry, but we are here to gird up everything else that's happening on Sunday. So in Isaiah 40, level the ground, the uneven ground, the hills and mountains will be flattened. Like, we're here to remove it, because the last part of that, I think it's in verse 5, it says, so that the glory of the Lord will be seen, not us. So they think we did a great job, but they're going to hear a message. We removed all their
barriers.
cookies.
The barriers.
And that's what we're here to do, to just remove all that and make it really plain so they can see the Lord. So we're here so that they can hear that great sermon. right? Otherwise, they'll be sometimes with, oh, they were rude, or this place is dirty, or there's no one even looked at me. And what he's saying doesn't even matter because back in the day, I went to Texas and I was at working for a consulting thing at a church, and I'm sitting in the service, and the pastor, I absolutely adore and respect. He did a great job welcoming everybody. Yeah. We're so glad we've been preparing for you. Mm-hmm. And I sat there and said, it didn't look like you prepared for me.
Wow.
Like it didn't align.
Yeah.
Right.
What he was saying and what they were doing were different.
They were doing nothing.
Yeah.
And so he said, Marianne, go walk the parking lot. I said, I already did. There's nothing out there. Like, it was really sad. I said, now here's the thing. An individual, I get it, won't be sitting there with my goggles, my vision, looking for it.
Yeah.
And go, oh, I didn't see it. But here's what I do know, what God does. With people in place, that supernatural thing, if someone, and then they hear a pastor say, we've been preparing you, the Holy Spirit goes, did you see that? We did prepare. Like, there'll just be that connection that only God can do. So we have to do our part.
That's so good.
That supports what the pastors are trying to do in their messages. So
yeah. What's the
working together?
Like, so if a church is listening to this and they're like, wow, we don't do that at all, what is the best way for a leader to get a process like that started or start building a team around that? You have another thing, Dale?
I want to tag your question.
Okay.
Because Marianne, we're talking to a lot of small churches that don't have big staffs.
Mm-hmm.
So this is to take this question, think about volunteers and that kind of thing as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. That's so good. A lot of churches I talk to don't have a staff person like I was afforded to lead this, but there are some amazing volunteers that can take this. And if I go back to the very early days, I just looked around and found the 2 or 3 or 4 people, volunteers that seemed to get it. Right. And I'll never forget, I brought them in a room and I'm like, how are we going to do this? Like, part of the language is what I heard in church, again, not growing up in church, I thought, doesn't everyone do this? I would hear volunteers say, wow, I didn't know we were allowed.
Wow.
To be a part of it like this. Like, this is so much fun. Like, I didn't know we weren't allowed. And I'm looking at them going, what? I don't even understand that language.
Yeah.
They said, well, no, only certain staff or certain titles. And they said, but I'm like, then you're missing some of the best parts. So I would say, look around and find those 1, 2, 3 people, get them in the room and have them, like, you don't go and tell them what you want to do. You invite them into a conversation and say, look, we really want to do something really extraordinary and remarkable and beautiful and what God is doing and wants to do.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, my favorite thing is to get in front of a whiteboard with my volunteers all through the years, from growing to 0 to where we grew. And I never stopped doing it. It was constantly blank. What's your hot point? What's your pain point? What do you think? How could we do this? So now you have great dialogue, you have great buy-in, you have people thinking, oh, you really care that I have a voice. You really want to know what I think. And then that builds from there. It's like, okay, the 3 of us, what can we do with this big picture? We can take a small bite. Let's start here.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times what I've seen are pastors will look at a staff person, say like the worship leader, I've seen this, or the youth pastor, and say, hey, you lead this ministry as well, hospitality. And I'm like, they don't have time for that.
Right.
There are volunteers that have the time and ability and the giftedness to do that. Exactly. So they're out there. They're just waiting for someone to invite them in.
I don't think I've ever seen a youth pastor with the gift of hospitality. I just don't think, I know I didn't have it when I did that. So before we all run out of time, I want to set a scenario up for you, and I want you to speak to it. So I'm listening to this podcast, and I'm either at a small rural church out in the middle of Kansas, or I'm in a small church in an urban area. And now our government or whatever's happening has allowed us to begin to open up. We already know that our numbers are going to be down. We already know that maybe we have to wear masks and social distance, all that kind of stuff. And we just brought you in, Marianne, and we want you to help us do the best job of being hospitable as we can. What would you tell us to do?
Well, I think this is my Japanese coming out. When I think just logistically, how clean and organized is your space?
Yeah.
Like that's, I think not really thought about, but it's something that's simple. And you can get volunteers to do that too. Like we had volunteers that just love to do behind the scenes and things like that. So I would say, all right, let's see, what does your culture look like? What does your building look like? Because there's not one size fits all. And where are your main areas that come in, where people will come in? And then where do you want them to go? So there's that legit. And then where can we put people? And then if you only have 5 and it'd be great to have 20, then we can maximize 5. Like where's the most impact that we can have someone coming in, they've heard you online, or now things have really was a hard year. They've a lot of loss, right?
Yeah.
And so where do we want to be most caring for these folks? Do we want to really put volunteers more in their worship center? Because in the past, ushers were more task oriented. And so they were just like passing things out and handing things out. And then they'd stand in the back of the auditorium and ignore. And you have people that are sitting, waiting for service. They could be ministering to people then. I mean, I have stories upon stories of our ushers that ministered to people waiting for church to start. Because it's a great quiet place. So depending on all that, it's just thinking through with what little we have, where can we maximize the people? It's not saying every door put a greeter. It's not what this is about, right? It's looking at what God has given you so far.
Maybe using some signage to drive everybody where they kind of come in one spot if you don't have lots of volunteers, so that sometimes people want to come and be incognito and they don't want you to mess with them. And we respect that. But now especially, we want people to know we care.
And if you can't have this is how crazy our volunteers were. We started having guides, as we call them, because we take people places, we don't point them. And initially I was like, well, I can't put them outside because that would be cruel and unusual punishment in the South in the summer. So I brought them in and I said, here's the vision. And this is an idea of the map. Here's the map of our building. And then I said, I'm going to say go, and I want everyone to go to your spots and tell me what's wrong with it.
Yeah. Wow.
And so they all went, okay, go. And people went to the auditorium and they just kind of stood in that space to see what it looked like. And they came back to me and said, so why do you have us inside the front doors if people are parking right out front? Are we allowed to go outside and be that friendly face?
Amazing.
And I'm like, are you allowed? So I definitely, if you couldn't have all these parkers out, you definitely would want someone outside. There's something about sitting in your car and looking around and you see a smiling face that knows, okay, let's not overwhelm them and rush them, but let's also know we're so glad you're here and I'm available if you need me.
Well, people are going to be apprehensive right now. Those who haven't been back to church yet, when they do come back, it's going to be different. And it would be wise of us to find ways to make them feel comfortable. And so that's why I wanted to kind of go there.
And let's do away with that click, huddle, talking.
Come on
together.
Now you
I do a whole training thing with our volunteers, and we came up with code words and strategies because that's classic church, right? Where everyone is like, oh, I'm so glad to see you. It's been so long. I love you. And then I walk in and I don't know you people. And I'm like, must be nice. Must be nice. I don't fit in with y'all's world. And so really teaching the volunteers that and that expectation, which is why you have to incorporate something like a huddle or a rally in the morning. We have to kind of get our hearts and minds set for why we're really there, not slap on a badge and think I'm going to be cool and stand at the best place in the building. We're not doing that. We're not doing that, right? And then the other thing that I think is the newer thing that I'm trying to help churches with is a debrief at the end of every service time.
So wise.
What does that look like?
It's 15 minutes tops, and it answers 3 questions. It typically involves your leaders, but if you don't have leaders, you involve your volunteers. So they're different layers. But with my leaders, it's like, I want to know, first of all, what was your takeaway from church today? 1 sentence.
Yeah.
Because it also held accountability that leaders got to church. Because over time, a lot of leaders are, I'm so busy, I didn't get time to get to church today. And so that may happen on occasion, but it becomes a habit. We're going to have a conversation.
Right.
So real quick, and then we get to hear what everyone's doing. And then we talk about What's a win? I need a win. A win that you had great hair today. That's a win. Like, I really had a good hair day today. I'm going to call
that
it
every day.
every day.
Dale, yours looks very good today too. So.
But we have to teach our people what wins are. Like some people, folks, I don't have a win because no one new came in. It's like, but you hadn't seen Bob, and Bob, came and brought his wife. Like, that's a win.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or your volunteers were actually more engaged today. That's a win. So we talk about your takeaway, what's a win? And then the last thing is, how could I made it better for you today?
Wow.
As a leader, what could I have done to serve you better? Or as a team, what could we have done better to serve our guests today? So
good.
That's debrief every Sunday, every team.
Wow. Marianne, you said you were 40 before you were ever invited to church, correct?
Correct.
Now that you are a Christian and have been serving churches for a long time, why do you think it took so long for someone to invite you?
That's such a great question. I've heard people are really afraid.
Okay.
Right? We have our own insecurities. So I think that's one. I think that people aren't taught. And it's like, hey, put this out on a tweet. Hey, put this in your neighbor's mailbox.
Yeah.
But there's something about building relationships with people around in your community, in your neighborhood, in your workplace.
Yeah.
And inviting them. And the beautiful thing, the culture of the volunteer ministry that I got to lead, they were bringing in people all the time. Like,
it's amazing.
It just became this thing where they're like, we love it here so much. My coworkers are coming. My so-and-so are coming. And I talked to a church leader yesterday about the ministry aspect of it. I said, do you know her story? Your volunteer story? And they're like, well, I really don't know. I'm like, well, you say their leadership potential, you don't know their story. That's number one on the list.
Wow.
And so she's like, oh. And I have heard that. She said, well, I've never thought to ask that question. And when I was building the leaders, that was the first thing. I'm like, tell me your story. And this one man, he led a large city, and he was in charge of the fire department. I don't know what title that is. It's pretty significant. It's pretty important.
Superintendent.
Something like that. And he was going to lead our coffee shop. And I'm sitting there going, tell me your story. And he starts saying, grew up in church. And I'm waiting to really hear, where did you surrender?
Mm-hmm.
And commit to follow Jesus. And I'm not hearing it. And so I'm asking another follow-up question. I was like, well, and finally he stops me and goes, wait a minute. I think I know what you're getting at, Marianne. You're wanting to know if I've surrendered to Jesus. I'm like, yes, I do want to know that. He said, can we start over? I said, sure. He said, because I have, and I'd love to tell you about it. But the reason I didn't answer it, no one has ever asked me that question before.
Yeah.
And at that point, I thought, well, we are going to ask that. Mm-hmm. That's going to be part of our culture. We're all going to tell each other stories. And if you don't know them, that's cool. Like, we're going to walk with you.
Yeah.
So I think the reason was because I was surrounded and saw people go to church, particularly when I was a single mom. I would see them in the garage doors would go up on Sunday mornings, and they would go. And then they would come back around lunch, and the garage doors would shut.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was a single mom and really hurting. And I don't know, but I think that it needs to be taught and talked about and really be explicit to say. But I found our volunteers were like, well, how do I invite them? I said, well, here's how it came to me. People just started a relationship with me.
Yeah. They built trust.
Tell me about your kids. Building trust, so that then they were like, you should come sometime. And when I said no, it didn't break the relationship.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to be comfortable with building and being intentional with the relationships and talk about it with one another in the church to encourage each other to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And cheer them on and help pray for them. They'd say, hey, I'm inviting my coworker, pray for me. Let's pray for that right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Dale, I have a different last question, but I can tell you've got one in your head. Do you have one?
No, you can go ahead and ask it, because I don't. I could talk to Marianne for another 3 hours. So go ahead and pose that question.
Okay. So Marianne, we usually end our podcast with one question, but I want to ask a different one to you, just because I've really enjoyed your stories, and so I'm excited to hear this story. But how has Jesus changed you? How has he changed your life?
Okay, so now it's when I start crying.
That's fine. We
Yeah,
do that sometimes.
we'll cry with you, so it's
Yeah,
okay.
We do that sometimes on here. Yeah.
When I think about the mindset of that it was all on me to get things done. Especially growing up in the particular Buddhist sect that I was in. It was about performance, and it was about if I chanted long enough.
Wow.
And all of that.
Yeah.
And not good enough, not fitting in. I write about back in the day when I went to school, there wasn't a multicultural school of kids anymore. Like I was pretty much it, and all the beautiful blonde, blue-eyed girls with their long hair. Like I wanted that. So I thought, wow, I'm so brown. I've got brown hair, brown eyes. And so just like, you wouldn't want me anyways. Right. Wow. And what God did through a group of people, I always say, I didn't know God, but I knew Becky and her family, that introduced me to church, that then brought me to who Jesus was. Because I honestly, y'all, now I said I was a big fancy vice president. I honestly thought at age 40 that Jesus was a cartoon character like Paul Bunyan.
Wow. Yeah.
Like I just thought you guys just used him to tell stories.
Right.
He wasn't real. And when I got to that point, like, he's real. And he accepts me as is. The weight just fell off.
Yeah.
And he did, I am just so grateful. He did one of those crazy miraculous changes in my life that took me from, being, I got it, I can do it all by myself, to constantly surrendering, and see him do something better and richer than what I wanted to do, and work in my life and heal relationships and have me actually want to like somebody. It's one thing to love someone, but going through a divorce and working through that.
Yeah.
Like teaching me to love the way he wanted me to love. That's not my nature. That's not me at all.
Wow.
So
that's so powerful.
He taught me to love. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh my goodness. My pleasure.
Thank you for what you do to help churches. One of the biggest things that I say it all the time, is, that there's this book called the Bible. There's a guy named Jesus who started something called the church. And in Ephesians 4, he told us exactly how to do it. And he gave us a ministry gifts, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher, to equip saints to do ministry.
Yeah.
Our churches have continued to remain small, largely because we're not equippers. And everything you've talked about today is about equipping, raising up, training, and then releasing people and letting them do what God created them to do. Yep. So thank you for who you are, for what you do, for your time today. And I've got some ideas for you that I'll share with you later that I believe that God wants to continue to use your influence to help churches. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Dale. It's been an honor.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.